Hello, these are flipped notes 5-7, the last for Unit 5 on cognition, and we're finishing up with different theories of intelligence. So let's get in there. So our first major theory of intelligence is what we call Spearman's G, or his idea of general intelligence. He did what was called factor analysis, where he just looked at different clusters of knowledge being tested and found that people who were good in one category tended to be strong in all the others as well. So he felt like intelligence was just one general mental ability and that there weren't really different categories. Other future people disagreed with this. The first, probably big contemporary intelligence theory was from Howard Gardner and his theory of multiple intelligences. He looked at people who'd had brain damage and at savants and found that some people may have been weak in some areas, but then could perform really well in others. Savants could be disability or disabled in many categories, but then sometimes they were genius level in other categories, kind of supporting the idea that there was more than just one general intelligence. So Howard Gardner initially proposed 8 types of intelligences and later added a ninth, which was existential intelligence, or your ability to kind of philosophize beyond life about the question of existence. Let me skip to this one. So these are his other 8 main intelligences. The first one was logical and mathematical. So basically just good with numbers and number reasoning. Scientists, mathematicians might be strong in this intelligence. Linguistic was your ability to use language and words and meaning of words well. Poets, journalists. Musical ability to not only produce music, but also to pitch or pick up on pitches and rhythms. Composers, violinists. Spatial reasoning, being able to locate and figure out area. A navigator and a sculptor would be strong in that intelligence. Bodily kinesthetics, strong at being able to control one's own body movements, so a dancer and an athlete. Interpersonal is being able to help with others, like a therapist or a salesperson. Intrapersonal is how well one knows themselves. And then naturalist, ability to recognize, categorize things in nature, working closely to nature. It's like a biologist or a naturalist. So the people that he recognized as exemplars, T.S. Eliot, the poet, Einstein, Stravinsky for musical, Picasso for spatial, Martha Graham, a dancer for bodily kinesthetic, Freud for intrapersonal, Gandhi for interpersonal, and Darwin for naturalist. Our next theory, similar to multiple intelligences, but narrows it down a little bit more, was Robert Sternberg's triarchic theory of intelligence. So you can see the tri in there, that it's going to have 3 types of intelligence. I like this one probably the best as far as an explanation for our intelligence. So there's 3 parts: the analytical or componential intelligence, and that's what would be assessed on like an IQ test or the WAIS or the WISC. Creative and experiential intelligence, basically your ability to adapt to new situations and come up with new ideas, to be creative. And then practical contextual intelligence, which we might call street smarts, intelligence that's required for everyday tasks. So again, that analytical is like book smarts. Practical is, can you figure things out? Nowadays, can you look it up on the internet and figure it out? When you are going to get your first apartment, do you know how to set up your utilities? And if you don't know how, where do you go figure that stuff out? And then creative, can you come up with new ideas, adapt to new situations? That's Sternberg's triarchic theory. Speaking of creativity, what is it? Creativity is when you're able to generate new ideas that are original but also useful. Some people can come up with some stuff, but there's like no use for that. And this is not really able to be measured by ability tests. Divergent thinking and convergent thinking are part of creativity. I won't go into those because they were in a previous section of notes. Other things that add to creativity, expertise, that the more you know about something, the more creative you can be with it. Seeing things in a new way, to be imaginative, a venturesome personality, which is where you just kind of want to try new things. You're intrinsically motivated, and if you are in a creative environment that supports creativity. Emotional intelligence is another component of intelligence, your ability to perceive, understand, use emotions. The test of emotional intelligence measures overall emotional intelligence, and it's 4 components. which include your ability to perceive emotion, like look at other people and pick up on their emotions, to understand by predicting and how people's emotions will change, being able to manage emotions, express your own emotions in different situations, and then being able to use emotions in order to adapt or be creative. So some people have higher, some people have lower emotional intelligence, and really you want to pick a career where it matches your abilities. So, for example, teachers need to be high in emotional intelligence. If you're going to work kind of more independently, say as an accountant, then you maybe could get by with lower emotional intelligence. Raymond Cattell identified two other types of intelligence. First is what he called fluid intelligence. And this is your ability to think and act quickly, come up with new ideas, figure out things, encode short-term memories. And this type of intelligence, he says, increases until middle adulthood, and then it starts to decrease. So it's kind of like I always think of it as ability to pick up on new technology. A lot of times you can do that till you get into like your 50s, and then you just kind of get stuck, and you don't really progress too much more. That's not everybody, but just think about people who might be examples of that. So fluid intelligence increases into adulthood, middle adulthood, and then it starts to decrease. So I think of that as fluid, like it's filling up a sink, and then it goes down the drain. The other type of intelligence that kind of makes up for that fluid intelligence that's going to disappear is crystallized intelligence. This is all of our accumulated knowledge. So throughout our lifetime, this is just going to continue to increase as we get older. So think of this like crystals in a freezer that they grow and they build on each other and build on each other. As you get older, your knowledge base keeps on growing and you just have more and more crystals. Now moving into looking at extremes of intelligence, we actually talked about these a little bit in the last section, but intelligence tests can divide people into two extreme categories. Intellectually disabled are those with IQs below 70, and those with high intelligence were considered to be IQs of above 135, which we can see this still has old terminology. We should be saying intellectually disabled there instead, but less than 2% in both extremes for the population. Over time, our studies have found that your IQ generally becomes stable right around the age of 7 to 9 years old, which a lot of people are surprised with because you think, well, I'm going to school, I'm learning more. But IQ is more than just your accumulated knowledge, it's your ability to solve problems. So studies have found that IQ at 7 to 9 years old is a pretty accurate predictor of what your IQ will be at age 18. So when it comes to testing for things like gifted and talented programs, they usually just do that in kindergarten and first grade. And then after that, you're either in or you're out because they believe that your IQ is already steady. There are other studies that do contrast that. There are some people who've had substantial changes in their IQ past 9 years old, but they're the minority. But IQ scores can change. It's just not set in concrete, but the majority, it stays pretty close to what you were by the time you hit about first grade. The Flynn effect is interesting. It says that over time, the average IQ in developed countries like ours has gradually risen and has been an average of 27 points higher. And the guy's, I forgot his first name, but Flynn, he actually just passed away this past December. But he said the reason for average IQs going up is because we have better educated parents, we have better technology, just better schools, better education systems all around has caused to this gradual increase in the general population's IQ scores. The last part of our chapter here is looking at the question of where does your intelligence come from? Is it genetic or is it from the environment? Is it nature or is it nurture? And that's kind of been a popular question, and we still don't have a complete answer, but the quick answer is both. The best way to study the genetic influences of intelligence is by looking at studies of twins, whether they've been raised together or raised apart, and then comparing them with other family members and other adopted children. But they all, let's see, studies of all of those support the idea that there's a significant genetic contribution to intelligence. So when they look at twins who have the closest levels of intelligence, it's identical twins. And the lowest correlations are between people who are not related and not raised together. If they're raised together, they have at least some comparisons in their intelligence, showing that there is a little bit of an environmental effect. Adopted children show a marginal correlation in verbal ability to their adopted parents, but the greatest correlations are between children and their birth parents, and not as much between their adopted parents. So is ability and IQ innate? The literature, it's still controversial because there's all kinds of other factors that are involved. But generally, heritability and IQ has been estimated between 50 to 72%. That 50 to 72% of your intelligence is from your genes. That's what these studies show. And again, the best evidence comes from twin studies. The IQs of identical twins who are reared apart, so raised apart, even in very different circumstances, still correlated almost as high as those of twins who are raised together. So even if they had a different environment, a really significantly different environment, identical twins still had the same or close to the same IQs, showing that there's a very strong genetic link in there. And there was almost no correlation between the IQ of adopted children and the IQ of their adopted parents, showing that there's not as much a correlation there because they don't have the same genes. Let's see, but what about the environment? So studies have also shown that children who are raised in really difficult or impoverished environments, their IQs go up 30 to 50 points when they get in a better environment. So that shows that the environment does seem to still have an influence on intelligence, but that only seems to really apply to the extreme lower end and the higher end. What about the effects of early intervention? Early neglect has definitely been shown to affect intelligence. We'll talk a little bit more in class about Romanian orphans who were severely neglected, but then how when things were improved for them, their IQ scores did go up. Schooling definitely correlates with higher intelligence scores. Programs like Head Start and some other pre-K programs are designed to help students be ready for school, especially if they come from environments that were more impoverished. This diagram is kind of an example that's usually shown to or used to show the relationship between nature and nurture on genetics. So we all, you start with your seeds. Those are your genes. And you can put those seeds in the best soil, the fertile soil. They're going to grow. Probably going to grow even better. But if you put those seeds, even if they're really great seeds in poor soil, then they're just not going to develop to their full ability. That's described here as well in what we call reaction ranges. So this is looking at the effect of a deprived or an enriched environment. So let's look at here at Tom. Tom, his range of what his intelligence could be is between kind of 85 on the high end and probably 65 on the low end. Well, in an enriched environment, Tom is going to be at the higher end of his reaction range. Jack down here is in a very deprived environment, so he tends to be at the lower end of his reaction range. Jill, she's down here to 97, but she could probably be up here higher than average intelligence. Alice, if she were in an enriched environment, she could be almost genius level. Whereas these people up here in the enriched environments, they're at the higher end of their reaction range, and people in an average environment are kind of in the middle there. So this is going to show that, we all kind of have this range of what our genetic abilities will do for us, and our environment is kind of deciding where you're going to fall within that range. The last part here is what about expectations that are pushed onto test takers? A stereotype threat is a self-confirming concern that you'll be evaluated on a negative stereotype, that before you even test, you feel like there will be biases against you. And this study by Claude Steele showed that if people believed that they were going to be judged unfairly, that they did worse on the test than they would have otherwise. We see this more in minority populations and among women of all colors. That's it for our cognition unit and flipped notes 5-7.